Common sense causes confusion, hinders our understanding of nature, and fuels destructive behaviors. For example, it leads us to believe that the only way to understand the basis of nature is to physically break things apart and examine the pieces. It's a very sensible approach for sure, but that's just the problem.
Common sense is trained by our senses. It therefore has a selfish perspective and no purview on a subatomic, fundamental scale. That's why, despite being totally logical, the underlying mechanisms of nature often seem to make no sense. Let's find out how powerful our minds can be when common sense is deliberately suppressed.
Let's ask the age-old question, what is the fundamental constituent of matter? In other words, what is the simplest form of thing? We'll start by considering something which is obviously not the answer, something which is obviously complex, a balloon.
The balloon, including the gas within, is comprised of a vast number of molecules. The molecules are formations of atoms, which are in turn formations of protons, neutrons and electrons. The protons and neutrons are formations of quarks and gluons, and the electrons are considered elementary.
Here we are only crudely representing our established scientific model of matter, but the point we wish to make using it is this. As we look at matter on a progressively smaller scale, we find progressively smaller and simpler constituents, and because these smaller constituents are less complex, they have less character. Take for example the electron, which is currently thought to have no substructure. We consider it to have mass, charge, a magnetic moment and 4 quantum values, but that is about as much character as it seems to have. It is considered point-like, and so it is presumed to be totally without form. It is therefore hard to make sense of objects such as the electron, objects which apparently lack what we would normally consider to be the most basic properties of a physical object.
And so, with that expectation in mind, and with thanks to science, let us now totally suppress common sense and see where logic leads us. Let us then again ask ourselves, what is the simplest form of thing? For a start, it must be other than nothing, because it is a thing we're talking about. It is something. But it can be no more than that. Being ultimately simple, it may only have a single property, and that property must be existence, otherwise it could not be a thing.
It is quite simply existence in its most basic form, a difference, separation or otherness from nothing, yet no more than that.
The words existence, other, value, difference, separation, amount, quantity, scale, magnitude, and so forth, all have the same meaning in essence. For example, take the word value, whose meaning can be modified by applying different contexts. Value might be taken to mean the cost of an item or the usefulness of advice, but if we remove all context, we are left with its underlying meaning. But before we progress any further, let's hear a very sensible person's views, one who is ruled by common sense.
I am a very sensible person. This is utter nonsense. After all, how can the simplest physical thing merely be value? That makes no sense. Thanks for wasting my time.
He is correct. What is being said here is indeed utter nonsense. But regardless, it is purely logical, and therefore completely rational. So let's continue.
The simplest form of thing is simply a difference, value or separation etc. from nothing, and that's all. For brevity, let's move ahead using just the word value for now. Common sense wants us to make more sense of it, for example by visualizing a specific amount of value or direction, but let us continue to suppress common sense.
We have logically concluded all things are composed of value, the simplest form of thing. We may reasonably conclude there must be many instances of values, many instances of simplest things in our universe, to produce the many considerable objects we perceive.
Given that these many values, or simplest things, are ultimately simple, they must be absolutely identical in nature.
To differ, they would need to have different qualities, which they cannot have because they are ultimately simple. Given all these instances of value are absolutely the same, let's write the simplest form of thing normatively, as absolute one. In summary, we may conclude that everything is composed of one. We are all one, quite literally. Okay, let's take a quick look at an alternative logical proof that all things are composed of one.
Let's assume all things including this dog, are composed of indivisible and identical elements, let's say fundamental bricks. We cannot amalgamate or overlap any bricks, because in doing so we would create new forms. As will be explained later, the fundamental forces of nature are a consequence of logic. We are, however, allowed to force our bricks to the limit of tessellation. Doing that does not violate the identity of a fundamental brick.
Returning to the analogous brick universe.
The voice of common sense tells us that to divide our brick dog into its constituent bricks requires that we cut it up. That we must perform a physical action.
However, by thinking only logically, we may realize no action is in fact required, because our brick dog is already divided into individual constituent bricks.
Now here comes our further logical proof that all things are composed of one.
In our analogous universe, a brick dog divided by brick is a brick dog. And in our actual universe, a real dog, when divided by one, is a dog.
The same is of course true of anything. A thing when divided specifically by one, remains unchanged.
Indeed, to divide something by one, we must of course take no action whatsoever. That fact proves all things must already be intrinsically divided by one. In other words, all things must already be formed from individual and separate instances of one.